So tonight we are here to listen to Matthew Horace for his new book, The Black and the Blue. A cop reveals the crimes, racism, and injustice in America's law enforcement. 7 years into his 28-year career as an officer, Horace found himself face down on the ground with a white colleague pointing a gun at his head. That moment crystallizes the toxic brotherhood and endemic racism Horace examines in his unflinching look at how police interact with Black America. Now a law enforcement and security contributor to CNN and the Wall Street Journal, Horace analyzes highly publicized police shootings in Ferguson, New Orleans, Baltimore, and Chicago, giving a law enforcement perspective on the causes of the violence and tracing each incident's impact on its community, including looking at imprisonment rates. Horace will be in conversation tonight with Ron Harris, his partial co-author and a professor at Howard University, as well as a former reporter and editor for the Los Angeles Times and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Help me welcome them both to Politics and Prose.
First, I want to thank everybody for coming. We got a lot of friends here, and some people don't know us. I particularly want to point out a couple of people. One is Selita Coleman. Selita, before we went to Chicago, I can't remember. I think I ran into Selita online, and I saw that she had been to Chicago, and then I found out she was a skater, and there was a whole world in Chicago that I did not know. And she really was sort of our guide to learning parts of South Side of Chicago, and I really appreciate her. We spent, actually, there you are. Okay. We spent actually 4 chapters of the book. We didn't plan on doing that, but we spent 4 chapters of the book on Chicago because it told an incredible story. It's almost like everything that's in the book is encapsulated in Chicago. And the other person I want to thank is Gene Fox Austin. And Gene is saying, why is he thanking me? Because, so I wrote the introduction to the book, and I said, Gene, please take a look at that. It was so bad. The Gene just said, you don't have to try to get everything in the introduction. Matt, is there anybody you want to?
Yeah. Before we jump in, there are a couple people I want to acknowledge in the room this evening. And Selita, thank you for all the work you did with us getting us situated, and with me in Tampa and the book in Chicago. Linda Spate, my very good friend of 30 years, and everyone has a muse. She's one of them. I have many muses. Rashawn Spain, thank you so much for your creative genius and your support. And I have Ron Nesbitt over on the far left. We've been colleagues for over 30 years, both in our organizations and law enforcement. And lastly, my cousin Sewell here, who I lived with when I moved to Washington some 35 years ago. So whatever's not in the book, he can tell you about when we start the book signing. So, and to Ron, an amazing job in what you do. And we're ready to jump in, and we're going to stay until every book is signed and every question is asked.
So very quickly, Matt, you were on CNN.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
I'm sorry. 1 second. Someone who I don't see. Tony Torres, are you here? And Tony Torres, who is an attorney with the Bureau of ATF, and he's helped me through some of the darkest days in the organization, and I appreciate you coming out. Thank you.
Matt, you were on CNN as a sort of a legal analyst and also headline news. You are also, you can hear me now? You are always also on headline news. How did that spill over into this book?
Right. Well, my background, at least in my undergraduate background, was in English, so I always had a desire to write. I ended up getting involved with law enforcement, and, all those experiences that we have throughout the years sort of create the backdrop for things that are on your mind all the time. And as I was getting called by CNN and Headline News and the different networks to talk about the shootings, specifically the shootings of Black men, it seemed as though they started out every month, and perhaps once a month or twice a month. And it got to the point where I was on air 4 or 5 times a week at one point back in 2016. And I started thinking about writing the book then because I felt that America wasn't getting it. And we saw the protests, and you hear the different sides of the angle and who feels this way. So I felt that a book would be a good way to both memorialize my experiences coming up through the ranks as a federal agent and police officer, and sort of keep my foot in both of those worlds that I've lived for so long. One being an African-American man, and one being a law enforcement officer.
So of the things that you saw, was there one incident? I mean, you had Philando Castile, you had Crutcher, Terrence Crutcher. Was there one incident that was so egregious that kind of stuck with you even after all those years as a law law enforcement officer?
Yeah, I think there were really two incidents. The first was the murder of Walter Scott in South Carolina by the North Charleston Police Department when he was running away from police and he was shot in the back. That was egregious in my eyes because I knew coming up through the ranks that, and I knew based on my commentary and the people that commented on social media, that was a case where I knew that had it not been for video, most people would not have even believed the story except for my people. Because we've seen and we've heard those things through the years and through decades. But when you speak to people, people go, no, I don't believe that. You know, they almost characterize it as fake news. And many people in the room today might be in that same position. If someone told you that anyone shot someone in the back who was running away, you might not believe it. So that was the one. And the Philandro Castile case was the other case.
What was it about Philandro Castile?
Well, in the Philandro Castile case, based on my experience as a police officer and as a black man who carries a gun, he told the officer he had a gun. There were two officers there, and one officer shoots, the other one doesn't. There was a kid in the car and a woman in the car. And then even after the shooting, as she's live streaming it on Facebook, there are still people who are questioning if it was right or wrong or the proper thing to do. The police department dismissed the officer immediately and said that this was not consistent with the training that we provide. But he still got exonerated in the court system. Mm-hmm. So those two cases were really sort of like a catalyst in my wanting to do this.
You know, we covered a lot of territory. We talked about, as a chapter, talking about how African-American men are seen as the boogeyman. We went to Ferguson and St. Louis and spent a lot of time looking at that particular case and looking at how it wasn't really about the police, but it was about city government that used the police that to oppress a community. We spent 4 chapters on Chicago, and we looked at what it was like to be, as we call it, black and blue. You were being you're a police officer, and you're also an African-American man. And so there's a sort of dichotomy there where you got one foot in the community, and sometimes people are looking at you in the blue uniform and saying, you're a cop, so you don't understand what I'm talking about. And then you go into the squad room and they're like, you're a black guy. You don't really get all of this. After all of that, is there any takeaway that, all of those chapters, again, Chicago, we looked at the cover up with the shooting of Laquan McDonald and then the transition. Is there something as you look over the whole book, is there a takeaway that you want readers to get? I mean, there's a lot of stuff to digest.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of information. What I want readers to understand and grasp is this. When people like me, with the career I've had and the things I've done and the education I've garnered, when we say that there's a problem, not to ignore the problem. So, and I've said this a number of times this week on national television, when you are African American and in this profession, the way you feel is you're never quite black enough and you're never quite blue enough. And what do I mean by that? Well, you put the uniform on and you're in the community and you represent, for some, years of oppression and injustice. And when I say some, I mean people who look like me. So you fight that challenge every day of getting that respect and earning that trust, hopefully, from people who don't trust police largely. And then you go in at work and you're in the squad rooms and you're dealing with people and you're hearing racial slurs and people's political leanings and people's feelings about minorities. And then you go out on the field and you go out in the street and you see how implicit bias and unconscious bias and even direct racism impact the way law enforcement is done. So those are two things I want people to understand. And again, this book is not anti-police. The book is anti-bad policing.
How does we had a recent incident in Philadelphia. How does that relate to the book?
Well, I think Philadelphia might have been the first chapter if we had started writing the book later. But Philadelphia was very important because when you talk about several issues, number one, policies. What are the policies that police are governed by when they're doing their jobs? Number two, this whole boogeyman effect that we talk about in the book of being black men and people being scared of black men and concerned. Starbucks, and everybody who goes to Starbucks and coffee houses knows that people use Starbucks for their Wi-Fi. They sit in Starbucks for hours and hours and days at a time. But when the police were called to Starbucks in Philadelphia, not only were 2 black men arrested and removed from Starbucks who had a lawful right to be there, but on top of that, the police chief, who is African American, supported the troops in the eyes of America before he had all the information. And he had to come back and retract the statement. But even now, in my view, his statement didn't measure up because ultimately he said he didn't know that Starbucks was used in this way. Now, how anybody in this day and time could not know that this is, but again, let's not blame the police officers. The police officers were called there. They were asked by the manager, just like any other business, to remove these gentlemen, and that's what they did. So, we're a far away from where we need to be, and that's what the book points out.
How does that relate to the Blue Line? That incident.
That incident in and of itself, if you look at the Starbucks video, number one, there were like 7 police officers that were in a Starbucks to remove 2 men. But then the police chief, the executive officer of the Philadelphia Police Department in charge of leading 3,000 police officers, he stood the line, he put his foot in the sand and said, "My officers did nothing wrong," when America was wondering if they had in fact done something wrong. So that goes back to that blue line in the code. We support our people at all costs.
I got you. You one of the things you talked about in the book is bias. In other words, sometimes it's not necessarily an issue of race, but it is bias, something that we all have. Either we have a perception based on how we were raised, what we saw on television, what we read in magazines, really how we were socialized. I would guess that you had an incident in your own career that had to do with your own personal bias.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've had many, but one sticks out, and we write in the book that when I was a police officer in Arlington, Virginia, right here in suburban Washington, I responded to a call, a domestic call. And, sometimes we don't know in terms of managing our own biases, whether they're implicit or unconscious. And I respond to the call, and I meet, and I can see it like it were yesterday. I was off of Glebe Road in South Arlington. And I respond to the call, and there is a Hispanic male who's saying that he wants Leslie taken out of the apartment. And he has a bruise on his eye, he's bleeding, he's injured. And during that period, and even now, if someone says you want somebody out and there's been domestic violence, we have no choice but to infect and arrest. Never in that interaction with this individual did I expect that the individual who was in the apartment was anything other than a woman. Well, that's at some level implicit bias because it didn't have to be a woman. All right, so I'm working with my own implicit biases, and as I move up to the apartment with my partner at the time, we get to the apartment, and Leslie is a man. Now, how does that change our interaction and how we deal with people? It shouldn't have anything to do with it. So we're talking to Leslie, and we're saying, Leslie, you need to go with us because your partner has said he wants you out. He doesn't want to leave, and Leslie's telling us he's not going to leave. He's not getting up, and my partner and I are sort of getting to the point where, okay, we've been here enough time. Something's going to have to happen, and you're going to have to leave. Well, Leslie's a pretty big guy, and we didn't know how big Leslie was. So at some point during that conversation, Leslie stands up, and he's about 6'8", and now he's 6'8" and over 300 pounds. So now I say, I need you to sit down, right? And now he says, I'm not going to sit down. He says, you told me to stand up, so I'm standing. Well, we're in one of these situations where, okay, so now we thought it was a woman, it's a man. First implicit bias. Now we have this very large man, and he's a very large black man. Now, if we accept the narrative that we should be scared of black men, and if we accept the narrative that he's a big black man, and then we accept the narrative that we should be somehow frightened or scared, then things might go in a very different direction. So fast forward some 35 years and think about Terrence Crutcher in Oklahoma and what happened when Betty Shelby shot Terrence Crutcher dead with 5 police officers on the scene and 1 officer shooting. So I might have been justified had things gone awry in using my firearm or escalating force. But at some point during that interaction, Leslie, who was upset about being asked to leave, put his head in his hands and started to cry. And we never had to do anything except for ask him to walk downstairs with us. But it was a very tense moment because we both knew that the non-compliance started when he said he wasn't going to stand up. The non-compliance remained when he said he wasn't going to sit down. And now we were trying to determine how to affect an arrest. But no one got injured, but there were 2 separate implicit biases that I had to deal with.
We covered a lot of territory: Seattle, Chicago, St. Louis, Ferguson, Philadelphia, New York. I'm trying to I forget all the cities. So anyway, we talk about all the things that were wrong. What was right? Did you go to some cities and say, I think they have a pretty good thing going on here?
Well, I know one city that we mentioned in the book is Seattle, Washington, and I'm very familiar with Seattle, Washington because I lived there for several years when I was with the ATF. And, they're a progressive department. They have very high academic standards. They've instituted community policing strategies. They're engaged with the community. They have a independent council who reviews shootings, shooting review council. And, we got to talk to Kathleen O'Toole. Kathleen O'Toole is a white female who was the first female chief in Seattle, Washington, and the first female chief in the Boston Police Department as well. And, her story is in the book, and she talks about, I think she was, when you and I were in Seattle, Ron, she might have been there at the time or soon after. So her stories were amazing, and Seattle Police is one of the progressive organizations in the United States.
What about, I think it was Chief Mangus in Tucson?
Right.
What makes him stand out?
Well, Chief Chris Mangus is in Tucson, Arizona. He worked in California as well. And I thought, and we thought collectively that the book would be more effective if there were more voices. It couldn't just be my voice. And Chief Chris Mangus is the first openly gay police chief in the United States. Well, what does that really mean? Well, except for the fact that our culture is so sometimes stand in the ground. We have those racist cultural tendencies, homophobic, xenophobic, and he's an extremely effective chief. And in the book, he talks about his appreciation and empathy for African Americans and other communities of color because of how he's treated and how he's been treated for his entire career. But I respect him and value his contribution greatly.
One of the things that we also found when we talk about all these incidents, for instance, the incident where in Baltimore where Freddie Gray was killed, and the recent incident, I think many of you probably know about the recent incident in which a police officer was caught on video attacking a man out of nowhere and just beating him, and he ended up in the hospital. The officer ended up resigning. First he was suspended, then he resigned, and then he was kicked off the force. But in a lot of those cities where these incidents happen, they have black police chiefs. Sure. In New Orleans, black police chief. In Chicago, they have a black police chief now. Charlotte had a black police chief. And some of them had many. I think Baltimore has at this point had 9 black police commissioners. And it has been under the control of African American leadership for almost 40 years. So why is this still continuing even with that leadership?
Right. Well, I'm glad you point that out. And the book again, it's called The Black and the Blue. It's not called The Black and the White. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And the points you make are very good ones. In leadership circles, and I know in leadership consulting and at a very high level of thought leadership, there's this saying we say that culture eats strategy for lunch. So there are some amazing police leaders in the United States, but they also need to be change agents. They need to come into an organization and determine how, from the ground up, to change the culture of organizations. Michael Harrison and former police chief Richard Pennington, in my view, were incredible leaders. What Pennington did,
they were in New Orleans.
In New Orleans is the police department that we talk about in the book. They didn't just have misconduct. They didn't just have a few bad apples. New Orleans had criminal cops. They had cops. There's one cop that we talk about in the book that committed a murder while she was in uniform. There's another cop that ran a drug gang and protected a drug gang. They had a culture of criminality. So it requires leaders that can come in and change things and get rid of people that aren't measuring up. So it requires a lot of things to include enhancing academic requirements, training standards, new policies. And we learned that there are some people that are getting it right. And Michael Harrison is one of those people.
But isn't part of that culture issue the whole allegiance to cops instead of the people that they are paid to protect and serve? I mean, as you look in departments, one of the things that happens, even if Ron Harris is a bad cop, even if he's inept, whether he's malevolent or even just simply corrupt and brutal, nobody's going to rat me out because nobody is going to rat me out. We always protect blue. You ran into that. Is that not correct?
Oh, sure. I've run into that as a police officer and as a civilian. It's interesting that we are paid to protect the law, enforce the law, and be honest and truthful. And a part of our cultural nuance, and I can tell you when I was a police officer, The first day that I was in the patrol car with my field training officer, the very first thing he said was, what happens in this car stays in this car. And that's the only way that you and I are going to have a good relationship. But that's still done even to this day. I don't know very many police officers, black and white, who haven't been told that at some point in their careers. And, you know, I go back to being a matriculating student at Delaware State University, my sophomore year. And I was at a parade in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I was attacked by a Philadelphia police canine officer. Wasn't arrested, was left injured on the street. And I learned about the thin blue line and that code of not telling because the officers that took me to the hospital for treatment interviewed me and took all my information. And when my parents obtained a copy of the police report at some point later, the police report said, number one, that I wasn't a victim, I was a suspect. And number two, that they were unsure as to the nature of my injuries or how I was injured. So I learned very quickly, and what makes this worse is the officers who took the report couldn't have known the canine officer. Different places, different jobs, different titles, but there is this code that says in some departments still, look, don't tell on your brothers, don't tell what you happened. And in Baltimore, if you saw what happened the other day in Baltimore, the one officer stood by while that assault occurred. So it happens and manifests itself in many ways. I've seen it. I've been a part of it.
We kind of looked at that in Chicago. I think. Do you think Chicago was probably the most egregious case? Well, Laquan McDonald.
The Laquan McDonald case in Chicago was definitely the most egregious case in recent history. If you all remember, Laquan McDonald was the young man, African American, who was shot 16 times while he was running away from police. Now, the police have been called about an individual breaking into vehicles. 6 or 7 officers respond to the scene. One officer fires 16 times. Now, four other officers.
In fact, nobody else even pulled it. One officer pulled his gun. Nobody else even pulled it.
No one else fired a weapon. But in the police reports that followed, the internal affairs investigators and the Department of Justice determined that 4 different officers told the same story as the shooting officer. And they all lied, and they've all been indicted, and they've been charged, and they're all doing jail time. So even in a case like that, in a job where you're supposed to tell the truth all the time, in a situation when someone is killed, now keep in mind, all the officers knew that this case was on video, but they still lied under oath. And then the video didn't come out for a year. So I don't know if they thought the video was never going to be released or they thought that no one was going to watch the video. But how do you get to a point where you lie about something you saw that was on video? You're comfortable writing reports and testifying to that fact to internal affairs. I mean, it's horrible. Again, protect each other at all costs.
You met a lot of people. One of them was Amy Hunter in St. Louis. You want to tell us about her?
Sure. I mean, if you'll indulge me, I'll read, I think, a little bit from the last chapter of the book.
It's actually the first chapter.
First chapter, so page 20. And Amy Hunter sort of sets the tone for, in my view, what we want people to think about, have compassion, empathy for. And I'd like you all to consider this.
You may hold that mic.
Yes, please.
Oh,
no, I got to hold it. Yeah. Right. I'm saying, hold my mic. As a part of my effort to further explore this issue, I traveled to St. Louis and Ferguson, Missouri, where the police shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown in 2014 sparked rioting and reignited the decades-old conversation about the shootings of African Americans by police. Brown's death was followed quickly by the killings of other African Americans by police. They galvanized this new discussion. I wanted to understand what sparked the incident in Ferguson. What had been happening in a town of only 21,000 people that has pushed us to where we are now? What I soon discovered was that for black residents in Ferguson and in St. Louis, the relationships between African Americans and the police were nearly identical. As I met people, I encountered a wonderful young woman named Amy Hunter. She gave me a deeper understanding of just how personal and deep the fear, the anguish, and the anxiety about police stops goes for African American parents. She is the manager of diversity and inclusion at the St. Louis Children's Hospital, one of the city's major medical institutions. Hunter lives in the upscale University City neighborhood of St. Louis, where median incomes run about $100,000 and where crime is largely an afterthought. There are no drug houses on the corner, no drive-by shootings, no gangbangers at every turn. Still, she and her then husband made a pact that they would give them the talk, the conversation many black parents have with their children about the special procedures they must follow when they are invariably stopped by police. We sat them down and told them how to behave if the police should stop them. Hunter told me over the dining room table of a friend in an even wealthier St. Louis suburb. We told them, don't smart off, regardless of what they say. Do exactly what they tell you to do. We just want you to come home safe. We will handle whatever happens. We don't want to have to identify your body because you've been shot by a police officer. Hunter was also one of the hundreds of protesters who lined the streets of Ferguson night after night following the shooting of Michael Brown. By her count, she was on the street nearly every day following the shooting, including the freezing cold nights when they protested against the backdrop of the city's Christmas decorations that read, "Season's Greetings." She was tear-gassed and held at gunpoint with M16 rifles pointed at her chest. I asked her why an upper-middle-class woman who didn't live in Ferguson and who had not experienced what its residents endured at the hands of the police would be so dedicated to the Ferguson protest. I reminded her that she had told me her sons were now grown and doing quite well. It certainly must not have sat well with her employers that she was out there every day putting herself at risk. I observed, why would she do something like that? She looked at me with a kind, almost patronizing look, and then she told me a story. When her sons were 12, she dropped one off to hang out with his friends in an area of University City called the Del Mar Loop. The Loop is a popular entertainment district filled with specialty shops, restaurants, and music venues. Unless he was touring, local resident and rock and roll pioneer Chuck Berry performed there almost weekly until his death in 2017. When Hunter's son arrived in the Loop, his friends were drinking. He knew that was a no-no, so he decided to walk home. He lived less than a mile away. When her son was about 5 houses away from home, he would later tell his mother he saw police following him. Ultimately, he said he was stopped, questioned, and searched. The police told him they stopped him because he matched the description of a man carrying a machete. He was 12, Hunter said. He was 5 feet tall. She recalled how flustered he was when he arrived home, frustrated and trying to make sense of it all. He was asking all these questions because he was trying to understand it, she said. Her son told her he had done as she instructed, but he still couldn't understand why the officer stopped him. He said, "But Mom, I'm wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt and a belt, and it's tucked in, and I have on Sperry topsiders." It was as if he thought his clothes could save him from the experience. But there's nothing he could wear that would save him from that, and I knew it. So he said, "Mom, I want to know, is it because I'm black?" I said, "I don't know, maybe." Her son continued to ask questions, she said. She could tell that he was troubled by the experience, the fear of being stopped by men with guns, the uncertainty of the outcome, the vulnerability. And as she talked, she could see that he was trying to hold back the tears that were welling up in his eyes. He looked at me and said, "Mommy, I just want to know, how long will this last?" And I looked at my 12-year-old son, now with tears rolling down my face, and I said to him, "For the rest of your life." She looked down for a few seconds and then back up at me. Now, she said, with tears in her eyes, "That's why I went to Ferguson. I want this to stop."
Let me just ask you a couple of quick questions. I'm going to ask you a couple of last questions, and then we'll open this up to everybody. The last chapter is called "At the End of Failing Systems." What was that about, and what were you trying to get done?
Well, the last chapter, what we want to do, again, because the book is not anti-police, the book is anti-bad policing. And what we're trying to do is just have a dialogue about policing in general. And we talk about things like mental health. We talk about the fact that the systems and policies that are created and put in place, and they sort of lay the backdrop for what police officers do. And for instance when you look at the numbers of people with mental illness who are shot and killed by police, I think 1 out of every 16?
1 out of every 4.
1 out of every 4 shootings, police shootings in the United States, involves someone who's mentally ill. But the police, by and large, are not trained nor qualified to deal with crisis with people who are mentally ill. But we're the ones who are called. And I even tell a couple of experiences in the book when I had to deal with mentally ill people. The other thing is that every police executive who we spoke to in chief said, and they said in different times, that anywhere where you have a disparity in economics, education, healthcare, transportation, and housing, you're going to have increases in crime. But no one wants to talk about the overlying issue. We all talk about that one officer that does that rogue act or that commits that crime, but we don't talk about the conditions that put police officers in the position to respond to things that they're sometimes are ill-trained or unqualified to do. So we end the book, I think, on a very positive note, supportive of police, but not supportive of government and sometimes policies that put police officers in these untenable situations.
All right. I think they'll do it. Okay. So we're going to turn now and open it up for questions. And
I always have to say, I'm not from the United States. I'm from the Caribbean, and I grew up in the Netherlands. When I came to the United States, I went to University of Southern California and, in LA. And somehow it got around that I was a lawyer, and although not in the United States, in the Netherlands. And people in the African-American community one day asked me to come to South Central to talk to me. And it was one of the most, I must say, up to this moment in my life, one of the most upsetting experiences in my life when they talked about the horrific police brutality and the viciousness that they constantly face. So after having said this, I want to ask a few questions. You know, there is some notions at this point in time, and you in the book, you said, with some suggestions to make policing more humane, make policing more following the law. But you also talk about the fact about what is called the institutional knowledge, right? The history of these organizations. Could it well be that at a time, and I'm happy to how you ended the talk about the wealth and income divides, et cetera, that at a time when, and I mean, this has been going on a long time in policing, not only in, for example, in the United States, but in Europe now. What you see, if you go to the jails are full of minority people. I remember when I left the Netherlands, one of my last talks at the University of Utrecht was, guys, if you do not do something about racism, and racism comes in all different type of forms, you are going to create circumstances like in the United States. And there is some problem of that happening there at this point in time. So my question is a deeper question. Is there any way really to fix these institutions? Or do you have to, as some people, even in the African-American community, have proposed that maybe these institutions simply need to be blown up and restarted, reimagined, completely redone, rebuilt from the ground up, to get the right institutional practices, to get the right attitudes, to get a right set of ideas and understandings about policing to take place, especially in a time with wealth and income divide exploding, with racial polarization exploding, and with all type of growing tensions between the dominant group that is becoming the minority and the minority groups that are becoming the majority. So I'd like to hear your view on that. Thank you very much.
Well, first, I think I owe you a Go Trojans. I'm a big USC fan, so thank you for that. Second, I mean, listen, every study and we all know, and we talk about this in the book, and we have a chapter that says, "Do Black Lives Matter?" Well, anyone who's educated enough to read can look around and tell by every measurable statistic in every measurable avenue that Black lives don't matter. Now, what does that mean? That goes along with what you're saying about the disparate treatment of minorities in the United States, the overwhelmingly overpopulation of the prison system, the over-incarceration rate, and those sorts of things. So me personally, I do believe we need a total overhaul of the criminal justice system. Now, not being a politician, how you start that depends on leadership. And leadership begins at the top. I don't think we're going to see it anytime in the very near future. There were some years when progress was being made in a bunch of different areas.
Particularly in policing.
But particularly in policing. And the 21st Century Task Force on Policing was a great model. Community policing, better accountability, mental health screening for police officers, consent decrees, and those sorts of things. But I think we need the right administration with the right people who are committed to overhauling this challenge. And it's going to take more than one police chief or two police chiefs. It's going to take an entire nation to turn back what has taken 200 years to build.
I would just say it's really, in a lot of ways, it's really not about police. It's really about us. One of the things we talked about in the book is that police do what society tells them to do. During the days of when we had Jim Crow laws, police executed those arrests. Same thing with segregated communities, segregated facilities. Police carried out those laws. Even now, certain communities get protected. Certain communities do not. Matt and I talk about it. If you lived in Baltimore in the Inner Harbor, if you had 3 shootings down in the Inner Harbor, that's going to be a change. If you have 3 shootings in certain African-American neighborhoods, there's not going to be a change. So there are certain priorities that have to take place, and I think a lot of that has to take place. And we talked about change. We've seen the different. We have to have progress. I guess that's what I'm looking for. We've seen change. African-American police officers, African-American commission, but the mindset is still the same. So going back to what you said, you do in some ways have to have major rehauling of these departments and a different attitude. And part of that, and most of that comes from us. It comes from how we redefine from our political leadership how we want to be policed. I'll tell you a couple of quick things. I had a police officer I'm thinking about Crystal Scott King. She said to me, to both of us, she said, you as a community, you have to train your police in how you want to be policed. And another police officer said, and what did she mean? She meant that you have to reach out to police officers, whoever's in your neighborhood, and you have to meet with them and you have to say, look, this is how we want it to be addressed. This is how we want our children to be addressed. These are the way we want things to happen. If you see my child doing something crazy, don't run them down to juvenile. Bring them home. That has to be a part of the process. The similar situation in, we were talking to one friend, and he said, particularly in African-American neighborhoods, churches are sort of a pivotal institution. He said every African-American church that you have a youth ministry and you have a outreach ministry, you got a homeless ministry, you need to have a police ministry. And what does that mean? You are going to have to go out and meet the police and say, we're going to have a relationship because you have to understand what we do and what we want. And at the same time, you're going to have to say, and we want you to come and talk to us about how we can be better protected in our neighborhoods. And we can tell you if we've got a complaint about something in our neighborhood or if there's something happening in the police department. So I think it's going to take engagement, a new form of engagement, both by police and by citizenry.
Yes, sir.
The first thing you said was what's needed is cultural change. There are techniques to do that. They've been developed for years. I did a lot of work as a volunteer in maximum security prison, working with inmates, building community. I had no trouble doing that. They built really strong communities. I could not get to the corrections officers. They didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't know, and they just couldn't hear it because the part of it is that you have to become vulnerable. So 5 years ago, I gave up my car so I don't go to the prisons. The last 5 years, I've been going to UDC, taking courses in criminology in that department. I still cannot get, and I've gone to see the community policing here. Community policing, billions of dollars have been devoted to that. But I go to the community policing and I see the police officers standing here and the audience standing here, and there's a confrontation, and us and them. That's obviously inappropriate. I don't understand why that hasn't changed.
You don't understand why it hasn't changed?
I don't understand why it hasn't changed, because if you say, look, police officers, as in mental health communities, you have debriefings. You sit through and go through and talk out loud openly about what you did this week. And everybody has to talk. That's a standard thing that they do in mental health. I don't understand why it's not done in the police department.
I know a lot of police departments don't see themselves that way. We were in a police department in Memphis, Tennessee, and the first time I went in there, I noticed something. I walked into the police chief's office. Everybody looked at me like I had horns coming out of my head. But I looked up on the wall at all the pictures, and every picture, police with guns, police with dogs, police in SWAT uniforms. There was not one picture of police talking to people in the neighborhood. There was not one picture of police handing out presents during Christmas. They did not see themselves as part of that community. They saw themselves as separate. We're insular. We do what we do. We don't talk to you. We don't explain anything to you. That's what we do. Now, somebody above him or her has to change that dynamic. But that happens in a lot of police departments.
And if you notice, one of the chapters in the book, what we did was we interwove in what we call vignettes. And they were the stories of individual police people from around the United States. And one of them, as a very strategic move on our part, included a very good colleague of mine who happened to be a white retired New York City police detective. And we said, listen, we need you to be candid about the way policing was done. And when you read that chapter, you'll get a sense that things perhaps are much worse than any of us ever imagined. But with that, I have a belief that until the consequences increase for the behaviors that we're seeing, that stand your ground, dig in the sand, close the ranks. Every time we see something on video now, our culture closes the ranks. And we say
you mean police culture?
Police culture, yeah. I'm a part of the culture. You know, I'm on all the social media sites, and I see all the language. And, you know, someone asked me last week on media, are we under attack? You know, and I said, no, that's an answer to people that don't want to be held accountable. The only thing that's under attack is bad policing.
Really quickly on that thing, because I'm thinking about the cop. He told us an interesting story, and here's the story. And this is how things work. So he said, we're rookies. I'm in the squad room. And the lieutenant, who never comes into the squad room, he comes in and says, who's in Section A? And he and his partner raise their hands. He said, look, I got some city council people. They've been telling me there's these Hispanic guys on this corner, and I'm telling them they're not going to be on the corner. And so at 5 o'clock, I'm going to come to that corner, and I don't want anybody on that corner. Okay? So he said, we go to the corner, some Hispanic guys on the corner just hanging out, nobody's selling weed. But we've got orders that nobody's supposed to be on that corner. So I go over to the guy and say, look, guys, I want you off the corner. I need you off the corner for the next 3 hours. And so one of the guys mouths off and says, hey, this is our damn neighborhood. We don't have to get off the damn corner. And he looks at his partner, and his partner looks at him. He said, did he just say that to me? They go over, and they beat this guy down. They say, take him out of here, and I don't want to see you for 12 hours. And what happened? The corner was clear. It wasn't because his chief said he wanted the corner. I mean, his superior said, I want the corner clear. Why? Because the city councilman said he wanted the corner clear. And he didn't ask how it was done. You just get it done. And that's what we see. And that's what I'm talking about sometimes. What we see is that those incidents start from somewhere else. They didn't start with the police officer. They started somewhere else, and they executed it. Now, we can debate that probably that wasn't the way to execute it, but that's what he was doing because he's answering to his higher up.
Yes, ma'am.
I have done a lot of work in the national nonprofit world, particularly with groups that are concerned with criminal justice and how it's impacting Black communities. And one of the research studies, it's not one, but there's several that say that, number one, police cops, and particularly maybe white cops, don't understand the age of black kids. They assume they're older than they seem. They assume that they're more culpable for the things that they're not treated as innocent. Kids in this country are supposed to be treated as innocents, and yet black kids are held to a different level of culpability. Also, the research says that there's maybe a lack of humanity there, that black kids are not viewed as human, and this all just explodes when you're talking about black kids in this country. Did you experience that, and what do we do about this?
So to answer to your last question, I think more importantly is that coming up through the ranks, I did experience it as a police officer, as a federal agent. And most of us on the job address it when we see it, because we see people, and we first of all, it's kind of biased because we hear their behaviors when you work with people 16 and 20 hours a day. Then when you're in the field and you're doing things, you see how people are treated differently. It happened on the police department. It happened as a federal agent. The difference in the federal system is that we have stronger and more rigorous consequences when things are reported. But the overwhelming majority of things like that are never reported. So I absolutely agree. And then the other thing about black kids being evaluated differently, it is 100% when and it's been proven. Every study has been proven. People see people. The police officers thought Tamir Rice was an adult. I mean, he's 12 years old. So, if we're all going to get evaluated that we're all at risk. Right at the end of the day, and our kids are at risk, and I just think that we need to stand up. We need to create the dialogue now.
Can you tell them about when you were an Arlington police officer and the suspicious black male?
Yeah, we talk in the book about the radio calls. So you get radio calls all the time, and some shifts. It's like every call is suspicious black male, suspicious black male, suspicious black male. So what I used to do was, every now and then, they'd say, respond to where there is a suspicious black male. And I would say, what is the person alleged to be doing? And in our world, what happens is the rest of the shift, mostly white at different times, they would click the mic in disapproval, sort of laughing, like, what is the person doing? But
the point was, because there's another example that you use about, as he explained to me, that you have to be doing something other than being a black male to be suspicious.
Right. I mean,
so just like you have to be doing something other than being a white male to be suspicious. So he was telling me about the story about the white male who was suspicious.
So you do this day in and day out, and you hear this on the radio day in and day out, and people hear it. Suspicious black male, suspicious black male. I responded to a call in Shirlington, Arlington, and it was about a suspicious white male. So what's a suspicious white male look like? Well, in this case, it was in the winter, the dead of winter. He had no shirt, jeans, no shoes, stringy hair, maybe 150 pounds soaking wet. Well, I think that's pretty suspicious in anybody's mind, right? And then when I got out of the car, I said, I need to talk to you. And he calls me a racial slur and says, I'm not doing anything with you. Then that let me know right there we're going to have a tough problem that day. Because most times people that are like that are either using PCP or some other hallucinogen or something. So, and it was a difficult arrest, but I didn't approach him. I called for backup, and we had enough people. We handled it that way.
But your point is well taken, and we did run across that. It is, and we really addressed that in the first chapter, which is called The Boogeyman, because you're so right. I mean, there are so many statistical studies that show this over and over again. We looked at one about, I think we talked about it in the book, justifiable homicide. It was amazing because I think if a black man killed a white man, there was 1 chance out of 10 that it was justifiable homicide. But if a white man killed a black man, it was like 5 times out of 10 that was justifiable homicide. And they ran the numbers about Hispanics and all the whole thing. And it just, the person, the profile that was most onerous is black males.
Thank you. Sir.
Matt, once upon a time, we talked about the policies that were coming out on racial profiling. And we talked about they needed to be followed up with a lot of actual training and so forth. Some of that has been done, but after going through the process of writing this book, how do you feel about where we are with training officers about racial profiling and staying away from that?
Well, I think if I remember the time period correctly, that was the time period where they were coming down with consent decrees. And the first department to go through that was the New Jersey State Police. No one was worse at the time, right? Once those decrees were stopped and once those trainings were given and once the monitoring stopped, old habits came back into play. So I'm a big fan of consent decrees because they do several things. They report, they monitor, they force departments to change policies. In the law enforcement profession in general, change comes very difficult. But when the Department of Justice says you will change, you will change. So no, things went forward and things have gone totally backwards at this point. And things are going even further backwards because our Attorney General is rolling back consent decrees that were instituted not just under the Obama administration or the Clinton administration, but also the Bush administration. These things have been ongoing for the last several decades.
So Matt and I, we've had these conversations for the last 30 years. And I want to, and I know I've known you for a long time, and I want to thank you for putting this this collection of experiences in a book because it's extremely powerful. And I told you the other day, it reminds me of Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing. It's that impactful. I want to raise it up just a little bit above the policing aspect and just say there are a lot of white people here, and I would venture to say that we are here because I know I'm here because I would like to know if you have any suggestions or any thoughts collectively about how we can stop collectively being complicitly white, because I
never heard that one. I like it.
I just came
that's a different term for me. Go ahead.
Well, I had a discussion in my workplace about Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of his books last year, and I was in a group and I said, I was reading this book, and as a white person, I only know about the talk and I only know about the insights because I have friends who I can speak to about this, and we can have conversations and help us understand. And when I read that book and I had this conversation, I said to the people in the room that I felt ashamed to be white, and I think what I meant was I felt ashamed that I have been complicit, unknowingly complicit, about the extent of the problem, and so outside of even the police aspect of it and the policing and law enforcement, as a society, this is a societal issue. And if there's anything you could grace us with today, or thoughts about how not to be complicit, what are the things that I can do every day, day in and day out, that will have an impact, no matter how small or how large? What are those things that we can do?
Wow. If I had one real quick answer, is that when African American people tell you things happen, they actually happen. They do happen. You don't have to see the video. It always gets me that, and it's funny, we did a piece on the thing that happened in Philadelphia.
Right.
And there was a young white woman who does a blog. And she wrote a blog and she told people what happened. And she said all of her friends sent back, many of her friends, white friends, sent back things that said, there must have been something else that happened, or the police wouldn't have done that. And as a journalist, and there's some other journalists here, we have been wrestling with this issue for years. And at some point, and I made this point in Brooklyn, I don't have a sister. But when women tell me those things happen, I believe them. Because I have a lot of women who tell me those things happen. I believe them because I know them. They don't lie to me. They're not crazy. They are telling me things, and why would I not believe when they tell me these things happen? The way Matt and I met is we met to do the book. We met in Philadelphia.
Right.
And funny, we sat there and we told stories to each other about things that we had been through. And then we just picked out some guys in the bar. And we just kind of said, so what's your story? And there were certain similarities. In fact, we were talking about, you know how it is when you were young and you would drive down the street and you saw the police car in the back in the rearview mirror? And the guy would say, yeah, and you watched that police car all the way until it got outside of the rearview. I don't even know this guy. But we're saying the exact same thing. And I'll meet somebody somewhere else and we'll say the exact same thing. So that experience is real. So if we say that, and that has been the issue for us, is that, no, these things are real. And I would just say, look, when people you work with these people, you see them every day. When they say to you, these things happen, it should not click in your mind, it didn't happen that way. There's something that should say, I know this person. I've been knowing them for years. They're reasonable, they're smart, they're intelligent. They just wouldn't tell me that if that really wasn't part of a reality that exists in America.
It reminds me of a story I heard from a friend of mine who was African American. He was a state trooper, and he said he was around some state troopers one day, and they were using the N-word like they were back in the 20s somewhere. And when he went and reported it to a lieutenant, the lieutenant said, "Well, you sure they didn't say Tigger? You sure they didn't say pig bigger? You sure they didn't?" And they went to this thing of, are you sure that's what you heard? Now, if you hear that, you know you hear it, but you know what you heard, but why question a person like that? You know why? Because no one wants to be a part of the problem.
Well, but assume that people here now and that the country at large, we're believing the story. And in that belief, I've realized that in my own personal life, I've been complicitly white because I don't know what to do day to day to change this as a society beyond having a conversation. Are there actions? Like a belief isn't, belief is an internal thing, but beliefs aren't anything until you act on them.
Well, I think what we're, and I appreciate that, Linda, what we want this book to do is to force that dialogue, because you can't change the narrative if you don't change the dialogue. And that's what we like to. We like to see people say, I read this book. I think you need to read this book. Because you hear somebody going down the wrong path and talking about things they don't know. Say, look, I read this book. You need to read that book because you're really not getting it. But like Ron said, believe people when they tell you. These stories aren't made up. I've experienced them. And every police officer that I know, white and black, has told me specifically that this book is on point. Now, that's a different discussion than what kind of heat I'm going to take for writing it. But it's on point. We're not making it up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate you both on the book. And Matt, I love your commentary on CNN. And all of us have experienced the things that you have in the book. That's just very clear. One of the things I'd like to ask you to think about, though, and I mean, if you could comment on it, the average police officer makes less than $50,000 in the United States. Most police departments don't have much money for training. So a little while ago, the black police chief, I think it was in Dallas, who retired, was saying, anytime there's an incident, something at school, something at a hospital, people call the police. And he made several comments about people call the police. So with police departments not having a lot of money for training, the average officer now needs to have an associate or bachelor's degree. His college, what he has to pay back, is more than what he's usually making. So what do you see as a future for training? And can you talk a little bit about police frustration in always having to come and remedy so many different situations that they obviously aren't trained for, or there isn't money to do the training and things of that sort? And the incident in Baltimore, if you could talk a little bit about that. It appeared to me when I saw that black police officer beat that black man like that, it seemed to me that there was a frustration on that guy's part. He doesn't need to be a police officer, but if you could comment on that, that would be good.
So to one of your points that deals with policy and funding. Well, funding is generated where? By the government in most cases. During the years when we've had funding for community policing programs, they were able to use that funding for implicit bias training and unconscious bias training, mostly because departments were under consent decrees, so the government put them on it, so the government had to help them fix it. Now, the community policing money seems to be drying up.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, all around the country, police department don't have the budgets to do it, and you're correct about the salaries. I'm glad that a lot of police departments have moved to having degree requirements, bachelor's degrees, at least an associate's degree. In many departments now, you can't get promoted without even having a master's degree. To your point about Baltimore and what you saw and the frustration, policing is very difficult. And those of us that have done it know how difficult it is. As we say in the book, though, what black people don't understand is why we're never wrong. Sometimes we're wrong, and we need to say that we're wrong. One of the things that came out of the 21st century policing model was officer wellness, mental health screening, background investigations, those sorts of things that we do at the federal level. But because of our culture, wellness is not a part of our language. If you ask the average cop in New York, hey, what do you know about wellness? Right? Yeah. They're not going to be able to tell you. There's no wellness programs. They may have them, but do they support them? And do they understand why it's important that you have 10 days off after a shooting? Why it's important that if something traumatic happens to you, that you go see a counselor? I still know police officers, you mentioned mental health. They're like, no, don't talk about it, don't say it. Depression, suicide, all the things that impact the rest of society impact police more. But we still haven't turned to mental health screening for police officers. You know, I would be a big advocate for every 3 or every 5 year renewed psychological testing, right? Just to make sure that you're still in a good place and you're able to do the job fairly. The situation in Baltimore, it was so off the top. And listen, I've been there. You're working, it's hot. You got things going on in your life. You say to somebody, I need to talk to you, and they flip you off. And, you know, but we have to be better than that. And police officers now know that there's a camera on every corner and every sky. Police, you know, and people, so I can't believe that we're still seeing that.
It didn't matter to that guy.
Yeah, it didn't matter to him, right? And
but that was a little bit more than just being, I mean, he had already attacked that same guy
before
in June. So that was a vendetta. And there was nothing there that that guy should not be on the police department. And it's like you said, he shouldn't have been on the police department. But going back to that thing about training, and funny, Matt mentioned something. We spoke with the new police chief in Chicago. And one of the things that he said to us, gee, that's what I really want to do. I want to get this wellness piece in. And he's getting pushback from his police officers. They don't want it.
Police officers. The union or the police officers? What do you mean?
It's not required. The officers are like, we don't need that. That's for wussies. We don't need that.
It's a culture. You know, it's a cultural issue, and the government is a little different. At that level, it's very different.
Thank you.
Last question.
Yes. Good evening. First of all due respect, I haven't got an opportunity to read your book yet.
That's okay.
Hopefully, that will be rendered. But I want to make a comment relative to what the lady said. It's a sad commentary. We come out to these kind of engagements, and we never can go out feeling maybe good about hope. So let me suggest that these are heart issues. These are not mind issues. I really wish we could say that policies, it's a matter of heart. And so when we recognize that this is a heart issue, we're talking about how we engage and we treat other human beings. Some basic creeds is do unto others as you have them do unto you. That's pretty basic, but that's pretty humane. And so I think that this what needs to drive policy, something very basic. You know, African Americans are human just like any other group of people. We're still having that discussion. Because somewhere there's this narrative or thought that we're less than human. So I think we need to start on a very basic level there. Now, one of the things that Brian Stevenson talks about, Michelle Alexander talks about, all of the folks in you all talk about is moving beyond, or like Dr. King said, where do we go from here, from chaos to community? And apparently we have decided for chaos. But one question I want to ask, one of the things that stuck out to me when reading the 21st century police commissioning was this whole notion from going from guardians to warriors.
You mean going from warriors to guardians?
Warriors to guardians.
Right.
If you could speak to that in terms of practical implication, please. Thank you.
Well, some of that goes back to culture and what we're taught to do and what we value in our jobs. You know, it's interesting. Someone said to me last week, they said, let me break this down for you, Matt. They said the only place that police are protecting and serving is in communities that don't look like ours. Well, there's this sense that we need to be warriors in one and guardians in the other. So until we get to the point where everybody's getting the same services, and I think a lot of it does come back to heart, right? But heart is difficult to evaluate, right? But within the organizations, when you see people, and we've determined that people have these characteristics, they need to be out of the organizations. And the police departments that are changing and turning that ship, like New Orleans, they're doing exactly that. I think the statistics, I think Michael Harrison said they fired 400 police officers between Hurricane Katrina and what happened down there and now. That's a major, major step in the right way. People that shouldn't be on the job should be weeded out, and people that shouldn't be hired need not be hired in this profession.
But you're right about the shift from warriors to guardians, and they're having that battle. I just spoke with one of the commanders there a couple of days ago after that shooting when 74 people got shot over the weekend. So I in Chicago, I called her up and she said these guys don't want to make that shift. They do not want to be guardians. They want to go out and crack heads and beat people up, and that's their belief, and that's how we're going to get it done. One of the big problems with that, getting back to what you talked about, is that in Chicago they have the lowest clearance rate on homicides than any major city. I think 1/3 of all the homicides are solved. That means 2/3 of the guys who shot somebody are still walking around. That's not a good statistic. And one of the problems is because they do have that warrior mentality, and they've had that mentality for a long time. When we were in Chicago, we had this guy, Father Flegler, who was Michael Flegler, who's an incredible gentleman, but he said something really simple. When we were talking about it, he said, Ron, Matt, people don't tell people secrets if they don't trust them. He said, you don't tell special confidential information to even friends if you don't trust them. And that's what's happening with the police. That somebody can tell on this other person, but they won't tell the police because they don't trust the police. They don't know if that information is going to come back around to them. They don't believe the police are going to act on that information, and they would be at risk. And when I thought about that, I said, that's very true. They won't do it if they don't trust you.
Thank you.
Can we get one more round of applause for author?
Thank you.